Let's bring in Negar Mortazavi from Washington, D.C. She's a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy and the host of the Iran podcast. Negar, always good to have you on the program. So Donald Trump said that Iran desperately wants to meet, but that the U.S. has no interest in meeting until Iran is actually ready to meet in a meaningful way. So is Iran not serious about these negotiations?
Thanks for having me. Well, I think what's happening behind the scenes, a lot of this through mediators, is one thing, and sometimes the U.S. president tends to portray it as one way or the other, as it is more appealing to his position. But look, the Iranians, what they have been saying is that they wanted to stick to the MOU, a deal that was signed on paper by both presidents, the Iranian president and the U.S. president, and their viewpoint is that the U.S. has been violating or not really abiding by the terms of the MOU, mainly the first point, which is ending the war on all fronts, including Lebanon. That hasn't happened in Lebanon, and the U.S. essentially did its own parallel mediation for a deal between Israel and the Lebanese government, cutting Hezbollah out. So the Iranians see that as a violation of the MOU. The second is about the frozen assets that were supposed to be unfrozen or unblocked. They're saying that hasn't happened. And then, of course, the Strait of Hormuz, which is the main sticking point here for the U.S. The Iranians agreed to open it free of charge. What they're arguing is that it has to be in coordination with Tehran, and that didn't happen. The U.S. essentially tried to force open a separate lane in parallel without coordination from the Omani side, and that really is what Iran sees as a violation in the Strait, and essentially that's how we got here to this escalation point. I think there's still the door open for diplomacy. It's a possibility. It's a narrow path. Every time you have a flare-up, going back to diplomacy becomes more difficult. But it's also about a trust, how much what you sign on paper, what you agree in at the negotiating table, and then you sign on paper is going to be implemented or not, or essentially the limits of that being stretched on the battlefield.
Negar, Pete Hegseth, he was also there at the White House. He said that Iran has been given the opportunity to negotiate, but when Iran shoots at commercial ships, well, the U.S. is going to hit them back 10 times harder. So help us understand this. Does Iran want to talk, or does it still want to fire on ships in the Strait, or is it both?
Look, from my conversations with the Iranian side, it doesn't sound like they don't want to talk. I mean, they initially, going back to the big picture, they didn't want this war. This is the U.S., Israel launching two wars on Iran, and the Iranians see what they're doing as a defense. But then at the same time, the point is, going back to the MOU, that they think if they go to the negotiating table, do diplomacy, agree and sign, and then that's not being implemented, then there's no point in continuing. So the MOU was essentially going to be a preliminary deal, ceasefire deal, and then there were supposed to be talks further on for a final peace deal, which is what the U.S. was pushing for, while from the Iranian viewpoint, the U.S. wasn't even implementing that initial ceasefire, the MOU. So the Iranian thinking is the U.S. will sign something, and then they will try to stretch it on the battlefield with force, with more pressure. I think the thinking at the White House, potentially by President Trump, is probably that if he puts a little more pressure, a little more force, he can bring the Iranians to surrender, capitulation, at least to force them to make more concessions. And the Iranian response to that has been that they're not going to surrender under pressure, under more force. And they are willing to negotiate, but at the same time, what's signed and what's agreed needs to be honored in order for that to move to the next step. I think that's the main sort of disagreement on the two sides right now.
Trump also mentioned that he's going to hit Pickaxe Mountain very soon. I believe this is the second time that we've heard him say that. Would this be a big deal for Iran if the U.S. does that?
I mean, it will be more escalation, certainly bringing it to another level. But again, going back to the goals of the war, the U.S. launched Operation Midnight Hammer back in June, hitting Iranian nuclear sites. That didn't end the program. And now going yet again for another potential nuclear site. It's not even clear if the reports are very accurate. The Iranians are refuting. Some leaks are coming from the Israeli side. So all of this has to be taken with a grain of salt as far as the reality of what this mountain is and the operation. But nevertheless, it didn't happen with Operation Midnight Hammer. Nuclear experts have been saying time and again that you can't just obliterate a civilian program with bombing and with just pure force. It has to be done at the negotiating table. There's nuclear technology, there's the science, and Iran has to agree, essentially be convinced to roll back the program. Otherwise, by bombing it, you can't just fully destroy it. So I think this will be yet another tactic in a big picture that lacks a real strategy.
Negar Mortazavi from Washington, D.C., Senior Fellow at the Center for International Policy. Thank you, as always, for joining us on Al Jazeera.
Thanks for having me.